Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, welcome. Today we're going to be chatting just a little bit about principled arguments, which are remarkably underutilized in parliamentary debate, given the fact that they are incredibly intuitive. They are how we make most decisions about the real world. And yet, most people are super scared about making these sorts of arguments because they think for some reason judges will not be receptive to them. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how to make fun arguments, how to make unique arguments that you might not have ever heard in debate, and also how to respond to them and why they are important. But first, I have a few questions, a few moral questions, that is, about different scenarios. First, is it morally permissible to enslave the 100 smartest people in the world to solve the biggest problems? Let's say you can enslave 100 people, and by enslaving them, you could help solve climate change, you could help solve global hunger. I think most people would intuitively say that slavery is intrinsically wrong, and therefore we shouldn't do it. And yet, if you looked only at the consequences, you'd probably get to a different result. Second example, is it morally permissible to target five Black employees, firing them instead of firing 100 employees at random? I think once again, most people would say that targeting the Black employees is a form of prejudice, it's a form of racism, therefore is unjust, even if there is like a measure of pain and pleasure, there is more pain caused by firing those 100 employees. Third and finally, whether it's morally permissible to kill someone in the waiting room of a hospital and use their organs to save five other patients. Once again, intuitively, we'd say that the answer to all of these questions is probably no. It's not morally permissible to do these things. And yet, utilitarianism, which we have come to assign this exalted status as the default framework in debate, the knights of the round table have kind of come together and said, well, utilitarianism is just should be the default framework because I don't know, it makes the most sense. But does it? That's what I want you to question. I want you to question that assumption that most debaters make, because clearly we don't only value consequences. We don't only value these notions of pain and pleasure, that there are other notions of justice, there are other notions of what is right and what is wrong in the world that don't necessarily center solely around aspects of how much pain is caused in terms of a calculation and how much pleasure is caused to someone else. So with that being said, I want to start just on a kind of more meta level. This isn't going to help you win, but why do I think that principled arguments are an important part of debate? And why do I think it's probably good for the debate community to have more principled arguments? First and foremost, it's how we make decisions in the real world, and that this kind of obsession with merely engaging with the consequences of an action fundamentally doesn't encompass the human experience. It doesn't encompass the fact that in our everyday lives, people are not pawns that we kind of are able to play our little games of chess with, that we have emotions, we have, gut intuitions about what is right and what is wrong. That if everyone were truly utilitarian, they would care equally about someone they've never met as a sibling or a friend. They'd say that the result of something is all that matters and someone's intention doesn't matter at all. And what I do think consequences allow us to have is it allows us to have a sort of sketch of reality. It allows you to have some sort of understanding. And yet, I think we could all agree that there is something, oftentimes something that we might be harder to articulate, that is missing. And what I want to do today is to give you guys the tools to articulate this seemingly unarticulatable, that clearly we have these moral intuitions. Clearly we believe, for example, if you want to use my example from before, that it is wrong to fire those five Black employees or to kill that person in the waiting room. The question then for debaters is, how can we make these arguments more persuasive to judges? How can we articulate them in ways that are actually going to win us rounds? Which leads me into the part that you're probably all actually here for, which is not what is good for debate, but is how to pick up ballots. Because sadly, debaters are obsessed with the currency in our activity, which is the ballot. 3 reasons why principled arguments are strategic and will help you win debates. The first is that they are intuitive. So you might be saying, well, I might have gone to Zach's lecture yesterday about frameworks, and this whole deontology thing seems really unintuitive. There are these 3 random pillars. There's, instrumentalization, there's universalization, and there's this idea of agency. How are these 3 pillars intuitive? Who picked these 3 things? And I'd say that deontology and framework-based principled argumentation is merely maybe 1%. It is the iceberg that is above the water that hides all of the iceberg beneath it. That maybe that's the type of principled arguments that are used most in debate, but they're not the only principled arguments that you can actually run. That sure, you can try to fit your arguments into this deontological framework, but as I'm going to get to a little bit more later, most principles should be intuitive. They should be a priori. They should be something which people are going to logically understand as being incredibly important. A few examples. First, the principle that when something is stolen, it should be returned regardless of consequences. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but when you say it like that, it's a lot more intuitive than saying, on a deontological Kantian stance, I actually think that this is moral because of this pillar. And I understand that philosophy can often seem very contrived. It can often seem very unintuitive. Your job as a debater is to make the intuitive seem intuitive through the rhetoric that you use. It's to say, for instance, that if I steal someone's shoe, I should return that shoe whether or not it fits perfectly. It is to say that you should treat someone else the way you want to be treated. It is to say that there are certain values that we ought to hold as human beings. For example, the principles of equity, the principles of reciprocity. These are all principles that we naturally engage in and we naturally view as important or valuable. And we should have room for those intuitive ideas in debate rounds. The second and important thing that I want to chat about is how to weaponize principles in the back half and how it can avoid pragmatic clash. So the same way that probably as novices, many of you learned the idea that it's good to have a diverse set of pragmatic arguments. You don't want all of your arguments to rely on one issue because there might be clash on this issue and the judge might be undecided. So if the judge is undecided on one conflict, one point of clash in the round, the benefit of having a separate pragmatic argument is that you can say, sure, you can almost wash that slate clean and say that none of those arguments need to matter because we have this other argument, this second kind of sphere of argumentation that even if you buy they are slightly winning on the first sphere, because of that clash, we're still going to be able to win this debate. We think that, broadly speaking, principled arguments allow you to do the exact same thing. They allow you to say that, sure, you might be uncertain about what is going to happen pragmatically. The consequences of whatever action you are taking might be unknown in the eyes of the judge. And this is super, super helpful for judging really high-level rounds that are oftentimes very difficult to adjudicate. So in many instances, for example, judges are left in a position where there are competing claims about the consequences of an action that are oftentimes very hard to resolve. It's a lot easier to say then in your RFD that sure, it was impossible to resolve this clash, or at least difficult. There was a far cleaner path to the ballot in this principled realm. And oftentimes, especially nowadays in the NYPDL and the parley circuit in general, since most teams are not running principled arguments, it allows you to avoid that clash altogether, that you're the only team that is able to gain offense off of that clash, unless, of course, they run a turn or some sort of offensive response on your principle. The third thing that I want to chat about is about how this engages with debate in general. And sadly, people don't really know how to engage with principled arguments. That we are taught, we are trained as debaters to become basically these utilitarian or consequential robots that are really, really good at engaging with this net benefits analysis, or almost this, this analysis of who is going to be the best cause the most good for the most number of people. And that's how we're trained. So as I'm going to get to a little bit later, whenever you read a principle, especially kind of in the current state of the league, you're likely going to get responses that don't engage with the core of the principle. That's important. And that is important not only for you to know, but it's important for you to point out when you are debating. Because, for instance, it's very powerful narratively in terms of having a narrative as a team to say, for instance, that sure, they try to give you responses that are pragmatic in principled clothing. They give mechanistic responses that are pragmatic, that don't engage with the heart of the principle. And if that heart of the principle is intuitive, well warranted, and strong, it's a very, very easy ballot for your team. Okay, importantly then, what are the 5 parts of every good principled argument? And newsflash, 99% of principled arguments don't have one of these 5 things, which is important for when we get to responding to principled arguments in just a second, because the same way it's important to write these 5 things when writing your principled arguments, you should probably also be listening for these 5 things when your opponents are running a principled argument. The first thing that you need to explain is the principle that you are defending. So you're saying that, we think that this is principally unjust for X reason. The second thing is that you need to explain why the principle that you are defending is important and why we ought to value upholding said principle. The principle of reparation, the principle of reciprocity is important for X reason, and then insert a warrant. The same way you have claim, warrant, and impact, you need a warrant for why the principle is important. Don't assume that your judge agrees with you that objectively reparation is a good principle. Don't assume that they believe that anything is a good principle. You still need to give a reason for why it is a good principle. I'm going to talk about 3 and 4 together, because I think that they're oftentimes lumped into one in a way that is very dangerous for the strength of your argument. So you first need to explain how your side upholds the principle that you're defending. You can essentially say that our side is reparative. It engages in this act of reparation. Our side engages in this act of reciprocity. It engages in this act of justice in a way that their side cannot. That under their advocacy, there is no way for there to be that same level of restorative or reparative justice. There is no way of that, that level of reciprocity. That's important because just because your side acts in a way that in a way that ensures that the principle is upheld, it doesn't mean that the other side isn't. So the same way that you can run a non-unique on a pragmatic argument and say, well, this link or this impact happens on both sides of the house, you can use the exact same logic to say that both sides uphold the principle. That's really, really important. I'm going to get to that a little bit more when I talk about the example of a principled argument in just a few minutes. And then 5th and finally, you want to explain why the principle that you are defending ought to be valued a priori to consequential impacts in the round. This is often the time when some people are like, well, how could you possibly do that? Real world consequences, quote unquote, are always going to be the most important. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to defend that in a second. But remember, everything is a real world consequence. Injustice that happens in the real world is a real world consequence. Just because it's not consequential, it's still important and it's still relevant to the real world. That, for example, we don't all go around stealing things and giving it to the person, like giving that object to the person that it could provide the most utility to in the real world. These things are applicable in the real world. So don't let that big buzzword that a lot of people defending utilitarianism or consequentialism, or people who will try to refute your principle, don't let them use that buzzword against you. Before I get to this, I just want to say, if anyone has any questions throughout, feel free to just raise your Zoom hand. I'll be just checking on the side. So if you have any questions, I'll leave time for questions at the end as well. Let me just check how I'm doing on time. Doing lovely. But feel free also to ask questions throughout if it's specifically relevant to what I am chatting about in the moment. Cool. Sixth part of most good principled arguments. In my paradigm, I pretty proudly say that examples are not warrants. And I stand behind that even for principled arguments. But I do think that when reading principled arguments, examples are comparatively more important, especially with judges that may not have either A, heard a principled argument before, or B, think they would be receptive to philosophical arguments. That's all in quotes, because I think that philosophical arguments is oftentimes intuitive principled arguments. But once again, some judges come in with biases against these sorts of arguments. 3 reasons why I think examples are important. The first is that principled arguments can seem abstract. So here's that sort of disconnect that I was talking about between principled arguments being abstract versus intuitive. They are intuitive, but they can also be abstract. Those are 2 separate ideas. So how do you bridge that gap and focus on what is intuitive instead of what is abstract? You can kind of bring them down through the use of examples. You can use any of the 3 examples that I gave you in terms of, for example, arguing why, in general, principles are important. You can also use far more simple examples. The example of the shoe that I provided earlier in this presentation about how if I steal someone else's shoe, I probably have an obligation to return that shoe, even if the shoe fits someone else slightly better. Like if I steal it from Bob, but it fits Bill a little bit better, is it moral to just be like, I'm going to give the shoe to Bill now because I'm increasing like the amount of pleasure? Most people would say absolutely not. And I think this will help kind of fire up the intuitive neurons in your judge's brain as to why your principle is probably right. The second reason is that it helps kind of with lay judges, and it helps show them that your argument is intuitive. Because if intuitive arguments are hiding behind philosophical veils, they don't seem intuitive at all. That's incredibly important. It doesn't mean that they're not intuitive. It means they don't seem intuitive. It's your job then as a debater to remove that veil and to show the judge, or prove to the judge ideally, why your argument is in fact intuitive. Third, you need to make sure why your example is relevant. So oftentimes people talk about principles generally. I was just actually doing an activity with my lab, so sorry if this is slightly repetitive for the folks in my lab, where there was a lot of examples about principle in general. And if you're talking about the principle of privacy, for example, you probably don't want to use the example of like the organs as to why you ought to value like privacy. It's not really all that relevant. So principles are not a monolith, that principles are specific the same way that any other argument is specific to that given argument. And you want to make sure that your examples are relevant to the specific principle that you're trying to defend, not just the idea of principled arguments as a general matter of principle. Okay, how does this relate to framework? The biggest problem and confusion that people have. They're like, well, I came up with like some principled arguments, but I also came up with some practical arguments. What framework do I run? Fantastic question. The short answer is never let framework be a reason to not run a certain argument that you think is good, that you think is strategic to your side. You're not trying to frame out yourself with framework. And if you think about framework as a way to frame out yourself, it is only going to bite yourself in the foot. So we think that, as a broad matter of principle, many teams will run a framework that proves why principle should be considered before practical impacts. That's great. You can do that. So if you want your entire case to be rooted in, for example, deontology, which I know Zach covered hopefully and probably in their lecture yesterday, you totally can, especially if the principle is about agency or instrumentalization. Or this idea of universalization. That's totally something that you can do. But beware that you don't need to run a this framework or make it your framework in order to run these sorts of arguments. You don't want to shove your principle under deontology or other common moral frameworks if it doesn't fit. You don't want to say, like, let me find a way to fit my principle into deontology. You instead want to say, how can I make my principle seem the most persuasive? So, if you're talking about the principle of privacy, for example, that probably shouldn't be run under deontology. It should probably be explained as a distinct principle. It should probably instead be explained as just why privacy is important. So, how would you go about doing this in a debate? Because you have to set a framework, right? You do, and you don't. And the reason I say that you don't is that what you start to realize when you become a better debater is that framework is more of just a weighing argument. And that you can say that your principle outweighs their case, and that your second principle outweighs their case, and that your third argument, which is practical, also outweighs their case. They don't all need to be under the same idea, that you can use different justifications for each of these. So you can almost think of it as running three like frameworks, that you're saying that first, you should value this idea. Second, you can value this idea. And third, you should value our pragmatics all over their case. How would I do this in debate rounds in terms of how I would actually use it? First is that sometimes if I was just running one principled argument and then pragmatics, I would just run that kind of part number 5 as a framework. I'd say, for example, in my framework, that the principle of reparation comes a priori. I'd say deontology if it was a deontological moral argument. And then I would just say, even if you don't buy our framework, here's our second argument, which is pragmatic. But if you're running multiple principled arguments, it's usually more strategic when you say onto framing. There'll be warranting throughout as to why all of our arguments are important. We think there is room for principled and pragmatic arguments in today's debate. We think that saying something like that allows you to have room to engage in certain arguments and to say that a certain argument ought to be considered a priori, but not put all of your eggs in one basket. Because importantly, I would suggest, and maybe this is because of bias that exists among judges in the league, you should almost always not go all in on principled argumentation. You should also probably, in most instances, not go all in on pragmatic argumentation. Because in general, putting all of your arguments in one basket is probably a pretty bad thing. So instead, in general, I would suggest that you run both some principled and some pragmatic arguments, if you can think of them in any given round. That usually every motion has a space for arguments that both rely on the consequences of that certain policy or idea or narrative, and also ones that don't rely on said consequences. And that you should be warranting out, whether through framework or not through framework, as to why your principled arguments are more important, both in your opponent's principled arguments, if they have them, but in more common in the NYPDL, where your principled argument is more important than pragmatic impacts. Okay, so how would you go about actually doing that? How would you say that principled arguments ought to be prioritized first? The most important argument that I want to leave you all with is that it depends on the principle. It depends incredibly heavily on which principle you are running. But regardless of that principle, there are a few problems with utilitarianism just to kind of, that you can bring up in most rounds that I want to just introduce to you as a jumping off point for how to run principles and how to run most principles, because most principles you're able to compare to utilitarianism in this way. So 3 arguments then that are usually pretty useful to bring up in terms of the problems with utilitarianism. The first is that it leads to the tyranny of the majority and mistreats marginalized groups. You can say, for instance, this would be a great time to bring up the example of the 5 Black employees. It's a great time to bring up the example that under a utilitarian calculus, queer people are oftentimes excluded because they don't make up a majority of the population. All of these are arguments as to why utilitarianism, or a pure kind of calculation of pain and pleasure, is really bad for minority groups and oftentimes the most marginalized in our society. How then would you compare that to your framework? Once again, the answer is it depends. But most non-consequential frameworks tend to be better for marginalized groups because mistreatment of marginalized groups is usually both intuitively and principally wrong. The second reason that utilitarianism is oftentimes really bad is that quantifying the good or bad of an action is impossible. Comparatively, it is easier to identify whether something is good or bad. Once again, this turns the idea or the argument that utilitarianism is more realistic or values the real world more. I'd argue that, for example, what is good or what is bad, oftentimes it is very difficult to actually quantify, much less figure out in the first place. The third kind of idea is that there are alternative actions which make the consequences of any given action unknown. So, for example, there can be kind of someone born 100 years from now that'll change whether a policy is good or bad. There are actors that you can never predict their outcomes that are going to influence whether an action is good or bad. So the example that I often give to kind of chat about numbers 2 and 3, which I oftentimes group together to make this example, is that everyone in this Zoom room probably agrees, for instance, that murder is wrong. But we all probably disagree on what the consequences of Medicare for all are. The reason for that is because of warrants 2 and 3, which is the difficulty of quantifying good and bad and the argument about alternative actors. But once again, I want to emphasize here really, really, really strongly that this is not the extent of your principled over pragmatic argumentation. That, for example, if you're arguing about agency, there are arguments about how agency is the logical prerequisite to utility. If you're arguing about criminal justice, there are loads of arguments as to why criminal justice ought to prefer notions of justice over utilitarianism. Like, it really, really, really depends on what you're arguing for. For example, the classic democracy principle. There are lots of reasons why you can argue that, for example, there's no objective morality, so what people think is right, we should do, or that the state can weaponize the monopoly of force against people so that they have an intrinsic right to have agency in terms of expressing how that monopoly of force is weaponized against them. Let's give an example of what a principled argument looks like. And this is, I'd say, a relatively good principle. I didn't write it, sadly. This is from the World Universities Debating Championship in 2016. The eventual winners of the World Championship wrote this principle, so probably it's a lot better than any principle that I would come up with on my own. So what was the motion in the round? The motion is this House supports the establishment of a Black secessionary state within the territory of the United States, the founding of which is supported by the American government. This is a policy motion, or right? Like, this is what like West Coast debaters or debaters in general would think of as a policy motion. So some people think, well, I can make principled arguments if the motion is about the trolley problem, or it says this House ought, or it says something directly relating to principles. Principled arguments exist in every motion. They exist in every sphere. They exist in every debate. Let me give you an example. Why is this policy principally wrong? Here are the 5 parts. So first, they explained what principle they were defending. They said that it is principally important to provide directly proportionate reparations for past harms. That's the claim, and like the claim warrant impact, right? Second, they argue that the principle is important to restore equality. And importantly, they added that any non-proportionate reparation doesn't actually restore the harm, even if it helps the marginalized group. So this is that sort of distinction between helping that group is not the same as reparations. Reparations, on a principled level, is restoring or repairing harm that was done unto a group. The same way that if I steal someone's shoe, I can't just be like, yeah, well, I'll just like give you a piece of paper and that will be helpful to you and therefore it is just. No, you need to return what was stolen insofar as that was stolen. So third, why then is reparations necessary, and why does giving a Black secessionary state, why does that provide a form of reparation? The argument that they gave was that providing Black Americans with a nation makes up for the displacement disenfranchisement and plunder of the Black community. This line right here is not a full warrant. This is the summary. When they actually gave the principle, they talked about the ways that they were displaced. They talked about the fact that the very kind of start of Black Americans in this country started on an act of displacement of white Americans rounding up enslaved people in Africa and saying that they can no longer live in their home, that they can no longer choose the nation that they wish to live in. That was the first argument. The second was that Black people have been disenfranchised, that through processes like racist gerrymandering, they're not able to actually express their voices, that through processes which restrict their voices, that restrict their votes and restrict their political power, they're not able to actually exercise power within the political system. And third was that there has been plunder, economic plunder done unto the Black community, that there has been theft both through the process of enslavement, but also through the economic policies that followed. Then they argued why giving a nation actually repairs these harms. It gives them a nation that they were displaced from, an option to choose their nation. Second, it allows them to express political autonomy in which they otherwise couldn't in a nation in which they're disenfranchised. And third, the fact that the US government is supporting this allows them to exercise economic agency as well. That means that under their principle, they've upheld it. Fourth, why could their opponents not uphold the principle? Because, once again, this was the World Championships. Their opponents were good. Their opponents weren't going to say, yeah, we should do nothing, for the Black community, that the status quo is amazing. Obviously, that was not the opposition advocacy. And government preempts this really strongly by saying that other forms of reparations do not work because they are not directly proportionate. That you can give them money, but that doesn't actually make up for the fact that they were displaced from their land. It doesn't make up for the political power that has been stripped from Black Americans, that the only way to make up for those three harms done unto Black Americans is to give them a state. Fifth and finally, how did they argue that this argument comes a priori? They argued that regardless of whether the creation of the state is successful, what is stolen must be returned. That is sort of the argument that they gave specifically. You can see how it's specific to this principle. It's not saying, well, principles important are general because utilitarianism is bad for marginalized groups. They said instead why reparation, like the principle of directly proportionate reparation, ought to be considered before pragmatic impacts. So what are some common mistakes, now that you've seen a very good principled argument, that people make when reading principled arguments? Three things. First is that they make them overly abstract. I said don't make them overly abstract. That is something that is good, not a mistake, clearly a typo. So you want to make sure, once again, that they are intuitive, that principled arguments shouldn't be something that is only read on a hyper-tech judge. That is a myth. And I think that the debate community, the reason why that is kind of the status quo of debate is because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that if people never read these arguments on, judges that aren't super techie judges, then they think that you can't read these arguments on like those types of judges because you never win, because you never run them in the first place. If you run an argument, I have won principled arguments with judges that are not super techie. I am not the techiest debater, as anyone who knows my debate style knows, but you can still win these arguments. The second is that they don't make them comparative. That's where I talked a lot about that third and fourth part of a principled argument. That, for example, if the principle was just give them something in return, that's not comparative anymore, because the other side can also provide reparations, that it is not unique to your side to provide that kind of restorative reparation. But when you say that it needs to be directly proportionate, you now are engaging in a comparative. You're saying that no matter what they do, they're not able to engage in this level of kind of reparations as you are able to. The third and final problem that I have experienced is that people will say, evaluate this principle a priori, and then they'll move on. You can use as many buzzwords as you want. That isn't going to actually change the way that the judge evaluates your principle. Principles need to be warranted and weighed the same way that every other argument needs to be warranted and weighed. So you start treating principles like those other arguments. Final slide here before we get to questions. 10 minutes left, so hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So how to respond to principled arguments. Because I hope that you guys hit principled arguments, because that will hopefully mean that you're in some wonderful rounds with people who are being really thoughtful and making some good arguments. 3 things. First, you want to make sure to actually engage with the argument on principle. You have 5 ways to engage with it on principle. You can argue that the principle they're standing for isn't good. You can argue that they don't support the principle. The principle isn't important. There are so many ways you can engage with it on a principled level. Don't take the easy way out. Crucial to opposition cases, but then also to the MG, I guess, if an opposition team is running a principle, is flexibility. You need to make sure that you are flexible. You want to make sure that you are taking their argument at its best and engaging with it on those grounds. Because if you don't, any good team will call you out on it. They'll say that you're making an argument that is pragmatic, that merely pretends to be principled. So be very, very careful when making responses like that. The obvious exception here is that your 5th and final response to that 5th section of the principled argument can be that we ought to value pragmatics first, or that we ought to value some other principle first. That is entirely okay to read as one response. It's probably not a good thing to read as your only response. Okay, number 2. If the arguments are kind of merely a pragmatic argument in disguise, you should point that out. Most people are really bad at running principled arguments because coaches don't teach principled arguments. Even in the camp, like, I decided to make this lecture because I realized that probably, if besides this lecture, most of you likely will not learn about principled arguments. That means that most debaters aren't very good at understanding, knowing how to read principled arguments. So how can you weaponize this? Usually people will be like, it's principally important to help the most marginalized. That's not a principled argument. That's saying that the consequences are important, that it is only principally just if it actually helps those people, and that if you can argue that consequentially it doesn't help those people, you win the debate. So if that is the case, you want to point it out and then make pragmatic responses. So yes, you do want to engage on a principled level, but only if their argument is truly a principle. If it's not, engage with it on pragmatic grounds. Third and finally, remember that there is not one layer of the principle. There are 5 layers, which means that A, there are 5 separate chances to respond, or 5 separate layers that you can delink or exploit or respond to or disprove. But it also means that some of them may be missing. And that, once again, because people aren't great at writing principled arguments, they're oftentimes lazy. And they oftentimes think that the judge will think it's intuitive or a priori, and not necessarily warrant all of that out. So A, you can respond to or prove that there is a gap between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, that they don't necessarily fulfill every single step. Or if they don't have a step at all, you should also point that out. So what do I want you all to get out of this lecture? I know that the lecture isn't incredibly long, and I know that this is not a 100% comprehensive, lecture on principled arguments. What I want you to think about is that pragmatics should not be the default. There is no default in debate. Come up with all types of arguments. Come up with arguments that you think are intuitive, that are winning, and that are persuasive, whether or not that they're principled. And importantly, if you are going to come up with a principled argument, please include all 5 steps and make sure it's warranted to the level of sophistication that you warrant all of your consequential arguments to. So I know there's not that much time, but it looks like there is 5 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions about anything regarding principled argumentation? Yes, Matteo.
So there's different types of principles, obviously. I'm just wondering, what are different types of them? There's obviously morally wrong to steal, stuff like that. But what are some more unique ones that you know of, or something like that?
Yeah, the short answer is that there's an infinite number of principles, because you can argue that anything is principally good, wrong, etc. So there's the kind of the principle. I think honestly, the more intuitive ones and the more maybe famous quote unquote ones are usually just better in general. So the argument of the principle of reciprocity, do unto others as you want to do unto yourself, is probably going to be more persuasive than some random obscure principle that some philosopher dug up 2000 years ago. So I think that personally, I've used the principle of reparation a lot. I've used the principle of reciprocity a lot. I have used kind of deontology a lot, which once again is the principle that everyone ought to be able to exercise agency, that you should not instrumentalize someone for your benefit. Basically, the idea that you can't use someone else to achieve net utility. And then also the idea of universalization, that basically any action should be able to be universalized. And I think that I've had a lot of success with those. The principle of democracy, I think, is also any politics motion. You should probably try to think about either A, whether you can argue the principle of democracy, or B, whether your opponents are going to argue it. Because it applies in most cases, and the warranting for it is pretty intuitive. I mean, the two warrants that I gave are probably the two strongest warrants that I've heard, which are A, that there is no objective morality, and therefore, morality is merely comprised of what the people believe. And that second is essentially the argument that, if the state is able to weaponize the monopoly of force, then, you should have a moral right to determine how that monopoly of force is used through your vote. So those are kind of the strongest principles. Obviously, there's also things like privacy. There are also things like you just have a right to privacy, you have a right to autonomy, but it really depends on the given motion. Yeah, Addie.
So it is the way that you argue principles under utilitarianism that violating principles has consequences?
No, that this is why I feel kind of have very mixed feelings about frameworks, because that is exactly what I see a lot, is that people pigeonhole themselves because of the framework that they're running. Don't think necessarily about fitting it into your framework. Your framework is merely a way to guide the judge's ballot in terms of prioritization. It's saying what ought to be valued in the round first. So when you say deontology is more important than utilitarianism, for example, you're saying to value deontological arguments before utilitarian ones. If you are running a principled argument, it cannot be run under utilitarianism. That doesn't mean that you can't have both principled and pragmatic arguments. It's just that under your two arguments, different frameworks will be more beneficial in terms of which argument ought to be prioritized. So instead of necessarily reading a framework at the top, as I said, you can read it at the bottom of your argument and say this argument in specific comes before pragmatics. If you're reading multiple principles, or if you're reading one, just explain why that principle is the most important, under the assumption that both teams will have pragmatic impacts and that it's more of a safety net. So when I say run pragmatics and principles in the same round, I'm not saying run utilitarianism. I'm rather saying pragmatics can act as a safety net in case your principle doesn't end up working out in the back half of the round. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Incredible. I think we have time for one more question if someone has one.
What's a good way to warrant privacy?
What's a good way to warrant privacy? Yeah, so I think you can argue that like fundamentally privacy is important for autonomy, and that violations of privacy fundamentally violate the autonomy of the individual, and that being able to kind of resist this this external force is a fundamental right that we have, even if that violation of privacy helps the person. People should have the agency to choose whether or not they share that information, even if it's harmful for them. The analogy that I use in general when talking about making decisions that are harmful for people is like, for example, we allow people to eat ice cream. We allow people to box. These are dangerous activities. Like, you can argue they're dangerous. Like, maybe people would be healthier if we banned ice cream, or if we like didn't allow people to box. But like, we obviously allow those things because if people choose to do that, that's their prerogative. So privacy is about allowing people to choose what they share and to choose what they don't share. Awesome. Sadly, we're a minute over your